This is Melissa Ford-Luckin.
Rosalie Petrowski.
Susan, Seraph, and Jess.
Editors for the Washington Square Review.
Washington Square On Air
Showcases the poetry and fiction
of the latest edition of LCC's literary journal,
the Washington Square Review,
read by the poets,
authors,
and editors themselves.
Expect the unexpected
as our contributors express
Experience and fantasy with humor,
imagination,
poetic license,
irony,
and passion.
If you love language
at its most original.
Please join us in our audio town square
to celebrate a community of writers
spanning from around the world
to Lansing.
This is Melissa Ford-Luckin, editor for the Washington Square Review. Today I'm here with Matt A. Hanson, writer, journalist, and editor. We're happy to have one of his pieces in our upcoming issue. The title of the piece is Mrs. Grammar. Thanks for joining us today, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me. It's fantastic. Very delighted.
Tell us a little bit about your piece. How did you come to write it?
So this piece is really just based on my upbringing in small town America. I'm from a New England town called Mattapoisett, and growing up in that town was sort of like a laboratory experiment in utopian living, I think, as a child, which has been so different than my life in a number of countries and cities throughout the world. First city I lived in was Cairo, Egypt, and I currently live in Istanbul, Turkey. And looking back on my childhood, I'm mid-30s now, and from trying to imagine just the stark contrast between being a 7-year-old in a classroom versus the concrete struggles of adult life. So I really wanted to sort of paint a picture of that contrast. And the main character, Mrs. Grammar, whose name is based on a teacher I had that rhymed with that name. And as a child, you see these school teachers and you see them sort of as single professional individuals, and it kind of creates this imaginary portrait of a person sort of disconnected from the rest of their lives. And in some ways, I think childhood is sort of can be a disconnection from the rest of life, unfortunately, perhaps unless you enjoy more healthy relationship to childlike impulses, if as a creative person, for example, these kinds of things. So yeah, I just wanted to paint a kind of a stark, tragic portrait of a school teacher who's facing eviction and also perhaps resignation from work. And this contrasts with the students in the class who sort of enjoy this wonderful experimentation, and they fail, and they are talented, and they get to express themselves, and they get to be in the center of attention. And the teacher brings that out in them. And sort of while napping, she disappears. And then there are these scenes where she's in her home. And I tried to imagine what that could be like, sort of this afternoon in a small town, feeling kind of disconnected and facing a kind of professional and personal desolation. And so it's got this kind of almost like, I think of this lecture by David Foster Wallace, This is Water, about sort of like, what it's like to push a grocery cart through a parking lot and sort of realize that such moments that, life is like sort of painful and difficult and boring at times. And but the wonder, I think, of writing is perhaps also a painter or someone drawing would feel is in that slight specificity of each moment. We can sort of appreciate just the raw details of that sort of appear to us either in combinations of memory and imagination. So yeah, so I think, short stories are this, I think Junot Diaz said, they're sort of like this close approximation of perfection in literary form, as opposed to novel writing, for example, which can be more loose. And so I tried to really just do sort of a contrast, like a basic contrast, childhood, adulthood, the experimentation in education, how precious that is, the learning process, and then where you get to fail, and failing is so much part of learning, and then that up against the fact that so many people are facing these sort of hard, concrete tragedies, and facing them alone, I think, which is on top of that. So, I mean, school being a lovely place in which we enjoy communal life. So I tried to create different contrasts within the story and sort of create a setting in which for readers we can perhaps connect with these like slight moments of discomfort along the way. I think especially the commute is sort of this a special place. For example, this story starts where she's listening to a podcast in which there's an author describing the education process as a kind of theater or literature, and sort of exaggerating with this kind of like highbrow mentality in a sense. So I think these standards, so maybe that could point to this kind of idea of cultural standard, the models of high culture and genius, and coming down to the ground with the basics of just progressing through your work and engaging with people and things like that.
One of the things that stood out to me about the story was the narrative style. How did you make that decision? What went into the way that you approached it?
So do you mean, for example, describing the character?
And it has kind of a, an omniscient kind of floating above feel that I think helps with that contrast that you've been describing.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I sort of, I think I gravitated toward third person in that sense because, I really wanted to create this effect of trying to see, more of a person than a person could describe of themselves, perhaps, maybe from the outside, kind of, perhaps in an objective sense. A lot of my writing comes from working as a journalist in the art world. So I kind of have this, I tend to think of things in terms of a relationship to objects, describing objects or describing an image in that sense, which comes through in the classroom scene where the children are trying to draw things and having ideas and trying to make connections between language and image. But the narrative style is a interesting question. Somehow I almost kind of see a quick leap from journalism to short story writing in terms of my practice, which comes from this almost like cathartic way of seeing journalism as a kind of short story form in a way. And so I'm trying, in that sense, I like to practice the short story form in order to become a better nonfiction writer in that sense. So typically, I mean, of course, first person is a wonderful, also nonfiction device, but in this particular sense, I really wanted to look back. This is a kind of a remembering. So it's almost like I didn't want to place myself. I didn't want to uh, directly address the reader, but I wanted to, so yeah, sort of have this be a kind of memory that is really also about the present. I wasn't facing eviction or anything, but I did move twice in the last year. That could subconsciously have affected the story, but yeah,
Well,
I guess.
the narrative style that you used really
Mm.
creates that observational feel. So it is. It reminded me a little bit about the play Our Town. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not so. Which
Okay,
one
it
is?
it very much matches what you're describing, where you observe people and you get to interpret their lives from a distance rather than, like you said, with first person putting yourself in it. It's more observational.
Exactly. Yes, yes. I didn't want to sort of assume that degree of tragic circumstance, perhaps.
Hmm.
But I did want to explore it. So
Can you
I
talk a
was,
little bit more about your journalistic work?
yeah. So I mean, I started in culture journalism in a digital section of a newspaper while I was still in high school in New Bedford area. And then I went on after university to into alternative forms of journalism, cooperative media in Canada, and I was always concerned with, you know, uh, healthy subjects. For example, not over victimizing, narratives of oppression that run through our society, but trying to show empowered at the same time, really reporting about difficult subjects, in terms of migration and uh, land defense and environmental journalism in that sense. Or so that kind of was why I think I ended up doing more cultural journalism, because what I found was that a lot of artists are from these incredible backgrounds of untold stories that really fit into the grander narratives that sort of dominate the news cycle in terms of war and economic struggle and these sort of things. So I was kind of looking to connect the dots while making for interesting reads. And I continued to do that in New York City for a number of years, working mainly in the dance actually field. I was reviewing 2 to 3 dance productions a week, and doing other forms of cultural journalism. And when I moved to Istanbul, I decided to focus more on the art world proper, which sort of ended up becoming successful on a local scale. I've ended up doing editorial work for every museum and number of galleries, um, and written for the leading art review publications around the world. And I always love when the ideas and the practices of writing about art uh, make themselves known in terms of their relationship to literature, because so much of writing about art is rooted in literary work. And so uh, so that's been so fascinating for me. And I've come to a point where I'm trying to do more literary reviewing and other kinds of reportage. I tend to I try to find unique approaches and in the search for my voice within this incredibly challenging field. So, uh,
Can you give us an example of a project that you've worked on that really stands out in your mind as achieving your goals?
I mean, something that comes to mind is I did a profile of a Kurdish painter named Zehra Doğan, who was exiled to London after she was imprisoned for painting the scene of essentially a war crime where the Turkish military destroyed a town, and she painted the town. The painting was seen as evidence, I suppose, and she was criminalized and thrown into jail. And her story from that point is just increasingly interesting and compelling. On the event of her first solo show in her home country of Turkey, I was interviewing her and producing this piece about how she survived prison, and in prison learned more Kurdish with her fellow Kurdish prisoners, and produced a body of work while imprisoned, which was incredibly moving. And at the same time, she was, when I interviewed her, and still today, of course, she's a young woman who is really rising to types of challenges and types of realities in this world that are unfathomable, perhaps, to me. And that when someone decides to continue to respond to that with beauty and personal self-expression, it's so inspiring and lovely to have the opportunity to be in dialogue with that kind of story, and try to understand that perspective, or that the ways in which she is connecting to everyone, is trying to connect to people, by telling those stories.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I'm thinking about what you said earlier about not focusing on the victimization, but really looking at the humanity. And I can hear that in what you're saying, that you're
Right.
admiring the way that she is moving forward and creating things and still sharing her voice and perspective.
Exactly.
I think
Exactly.
You mentioned
Yes.
also doing literary reviewing. Can you talk some about that?
Yeah, I frequently review novels and nonfiction works, and for example, with a magazine called World Literature Today, or Words Without Borders, or a number of outlets. I reviewed a very interesting book last year called The Undercurrents by an art writer named Kirsty Bell, based in Berlin, and that was very fascinating because of the way in which the first person writing was able to unravel this tangled web of Berlin's history tied to its cultural heritage, and in a way that was excitingly contemporary, and and spoke to these themes that are very uh, alive in contemporary art, where it's not about what is necessarily visible, but what about what makes itself known through experience, for example, or through being in a particular place and having a connection with something that is personal. And I think that's like a sort of lovely way that any art making tries to come to a place in which, outside of the increased commodification of objects and images, how are these ways in which we communicate actually moving us, and actually connecting us and inspiring us to whether it's an ecology, or whether it's our sense of history, or whether it's our own experience, health, family, all these, any theme you want. But that, so I liked that, doing that book. I mean, I recently reviewed Nights of Plague by Orhan Pamuk, in which I really got to discuss the adaptation of history and contemporary fiction in a way that I found I really grasped. That was exciting, to write that about his latest 700-page historical epic.
Do you find yourself doing research while you're working on the reviews, or doing research perhaps after?
Of course, yes, yes. Research is so essential to engaging with material. I think with any material, in this field. Of course, there's always a constant, for example, constant research of words, constant research of references, and supplementary material. Yeah, and I of course, I mean, seek and in search of, all kinds of sources, whether it's academic or, any kind of artistic work, or that kind of research is necessary. Speaking with people, friends, and readers and such.
It sounds fascinating. You must learn a lot of new things. That's why I was wondering if you did additional research even after you finished the project.
Of course, I think because so much of what motivates us is this kind of threads of continuity, and always in sort of pursuit of something that we feel like we're getting towards. We're kind of more able to express with greater clarity, or some kind of firmer grasp or something. Yeah, so I mean, everything becomes, in that sense, material becomes sort of the next sort of stitch or knot on a line of inquiry that I think.
Yeah. What kind of project are you working on now?
A number of projects. I'm doing a piece for a journal called Public in Canada, and they're an art journal, and the piece is a profile on artist named Is Oztat, who has created a fictional archive out of an alter ego who lived a century ago. And although she lives in the contemporary art world and she's a installation artist, she has essentially created a literary narrative in the form of an autobiography, which is very much in the vein of Virginia Woolf's Orlando and Gertrude Stein's autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. And
Wonderful.
yeah, so I'm finding whenever an artist approaches literary history and writing, but not necessarily with as much words, for example, or in the same form in terms of writing as a novelist would, or a writer would, I would, or however we can say. I mean, that someone who deals mainly in images and mainly in spatial expressions, for example. I find that that's always so captivating to me, because I come from a sort of background that is really remote from art world type of thinking. I'm sort of coming from a very literary middle class. It's either books or music, you know what I mean? Whatever you can get at this store, around the corner, you know what I mean? This idea of, unfortunately, I shouldn't maybe say it so generally, but really as an adult, I've come to my work, fortunately enough, to appreciate different takes on historiography, on how we're creating history and heritage and culture. And so that artist in particular, who I've known and what became the subject of this recent article. For example, I mean, I'm drafting novels as well these days, but I mean, historical fiction, and I'm trying to sell them to literary agents, and going through the
through the process,
the great joys of yeah. But in any case,
I'm familiar. No. If our listeners would like to stay in touch with you and follow you in your work, where can they find you online?
Yes, I mean, they can find me. I have an Instagram, Twitter. My name is Matt A. Hanson. I'm in a few different publications. I suppose I'm reachable.
All right, well, we'll put that information in the show notes. Thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to our talented poets and authors.
Until next time, this has been Washington Square on Air,
where we showcase selections from Lansing Community College's literary journal,
The Washington Square Review,
a publication featuring writers from the Great Lakes State
across the nation
and around the world.
To find out more about the Washington Square Review,
visit lcc.edu/WSR.
We hope you enjoyed listening.
as much as we enjoyed sharing.